He came to the mountains to disappear, an ex-Navy SEAL who had lost everything except the loyal German shepherd that refused to leave his side. But on a freezing night when the wind screamed through Greywind Valley, Frigg suddenly bolted into the storm as if chasing a dying soul, and that's when Ephraim found her, a young officer hanging from a shattered tree limb, her canine bleeding at her feet, both left to die in the snow. Saving them should have ended the nightmare, but it was only the beginning. What she whispered in the dim firelight exposed a secret someone powerful would kill to bury. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Winter winds scraped low across the valley, carrying the faint rattle of ice against the bare aspens. Ephraim Calder moved through the half-finished doorway of his hand-built cabin, shoulders bent beneath the weight of another frigid morning. He looked like a man carved out of the land itself, tall, broad-shouldered, around 40, with a face sharpened by grief and weather. His skin had the coarse, wind-stripped tone of someone who had lived too long outdoors, and his jaw carried a line of dark stubble he rarely bothered to shave. Deep grooves creased the corners of his eyes, not only from years of military strain, but from sleepless nights that refused to release him. Ephraim had once been a Navy special warfare operator, precise, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to the people he loved. Now he carried the silence of a man who had run out of places to put his sorrow. The tragedy that took his wife and daughter 2 years earlier, an oil-slick road, a drunk driver, a phone call that opened a wound that would never close, left him clinging to the world by instinct rather than conviction. He had not fled society as much as it had ceased to make sense without the two faces that once gave it meaning. So he chose Greywind Valley, a glacial basin tucked deep in northwestern Wyoming, where the wind never stopped moving and storms rose like old spirits over the ridge. Instead of buying a home, he built one from scavenged cedar and pine, dragging lumber on his back, carving beams by hand, working until sweat froze in the creases of his shirt. It gave him purpose, or at least the illusion of one. Each nail he hammered into the timber felt like a conversation with ghosts. Watching him from the snow-matted grass was Frigg, his 4-year-old German shepherd. The dog had a thick sable coat and amber eyes as sharp as a striking flint. She had been discarded from a disbanded training center, judged too reactive, though Ephraim suspected she had simply belonged to the wrong kind of handler. With him, she carried a different energy, alert, intelligent, protective, without being possessive. At around 75 pounds, she moved with the cautious discipline of a working dog, but spent her quiet moments leaning against Ephraim's leg, as if reminding him that companionship did not always require words. He knelt beside her now, scratching behind her ear. "You hungry?" he murmured. Frigg gave a low chuff of agreement, her breath fogging the air in a tiny cloud. Ephraim felt a strange sense of comfort in the dog's presence. He told himself it was practicality, someone to alert him to trouble, someone to watch the woods where mountain lions sometimes prowled, but the truth was simpler. Frigg was the only living creature who anchored him to the world. He moved around the small cabin, its interior rough but functional. A simple iron stove sat in the corner, wired with a makeshift chimney that punched through the roof. The walls smelled of fresh-hewn pine. Tools hung in careful rows. Ephraim still kept order like a soldier, and a single wooden cot took up the far wall. On a shelf above it lay 2 photographs he allowed himself to keep. One of Maeve, his wife, whose auburn hair cascaded in effortless waves over her shoulders. She had been a painter, soft-spoken, but with eyes that flashed mischief whenever she smiled. The other was of their daughter, Kalia, with the same bright hazel gaze and a missing front tooth she used to proudly display. Ephraim looked at those photographs every morning, but only long enough to feel their presence, never long enough to drown in it. Grief was a tide he kept at arm's length. If he let it rush in fully, he feared he'd never stand again. Outside, the wind shifted, sending a low moan across the valley. Mist rose off the frozen creek, and the sky carried a dull pewter color that meant snow before nightfall. Ephraim stepped out to split logs, pushing aside the tightness that gripped his chest when the air turned too still. He hated silence. It reminded him of his old home after the accident, when casseroles arrived from neighbors and condolences from colleagues, but the rooms echoed without laughter. Out here, silence at least felt natural. Frigg circled the clearing, nose twitching. She paused, ears pricking toward the northern ridge. Ephraim watched her behavior with a soldier's instinct. "See something?" he asked. The dog didn't bark, but her stance changed. Steady, braced, focused. It wasn't danger, he decided, just curiosity. The woods held scents of mule deer, foxes, and the occasional stray hunter passing deeper into the range. Frigg had grown adept at reading Ephraim's moods, perhaps because he rarely spoke. She nudged his hand now, sensing tension rising from old memories. "I'm all right," he whispered, though the words were more habit than truth. He looked around the cabin site, the rough-hewn fence, the stacked lumber, the half-finished smokehouse he swore he'd complete before spring. All of it was a life he had built not to thrive, but to survive one day after another. Yet a small thought entered the back of his mind, uninvited and stubborn. Maybe survival was a beginning, not an end. Snow began falling, slow, deliberate flakes that drifted like soft ash from the sky. Ephraim paused mid-swing with his axe, watching them settle on Frigg's fur. The dog blinked up at him as if asking whether they should go inside. "Soon," he said, but Ephraim felt something shifting in the valley, an intuition sharpened by years in conflict zones. Winter had a way of burying secrets, but it also had a way of revealing what refused to stay hidden. What he did not know yet, what no instinct could warn him, was that footsteps he had not heard and a life he had not expected were already wandering somewhere beyond the tree line, moving slowly toward him. And when they arrived, the solitude he built like armor would begin to crack. The first storm of the season came before dawn, dragging a curtain of white across Greywind Valley. Snowflakes drifted like powdered glass through the air, thickening with each breath Ephraim Calder drew. Ephraim stepped outside with Frigg at his heel, intending only to gather firewood before the storm grew worse. But the German shepherd's sudden sharp bark tore through the quiet, her sable coat bristling as she bolted toward the tree line. Ephraim followed, boots sinking deep into untouched snow. The cold bit at his cheeks, turning his breath to steam as he reached the place where Frigg had stopped. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on the ground, where a single trail of footprints stretched down from the northern ridge. Ephraim crouched, running a gloved hand across the indentations. The prints were fresh, made within the last hour, and they were human. But something was wrong. The snow ahead was disturbed. Behind, nothing. "No return path," Ephraim muttered. The valley rarely welcomed visitors, much less ones who arrived at dawn through a rising storm. He studied the footprints again. The stride was uneven, as though the person had been limping or dragging weight. Frigg sniffed the snow, then gave a low, uneasy whine. Ephraim's instincts sharpened. A single path in, no path out. Someone had either collapsed, been taken, or found shelter, if they were lucky enough to find it at all, in a place where winter punished recklessness. He rose to his full height, his breath clouding the air, and followed the trail deeper into the valley. The footprints led him toward a jut of stone on the valley's eastern wall, a natural alcove formed by centuries of wind carving into the mountain. Frigg paced nervously beside him, her ears flicking at every shift of the storm. As they neared the rock face, Ephraim noticed a patch of disturbed snow near the entrance. Something metallic glimmered beneath the surface. He brushed away the snow and froze. A handcuff, one side shattered, its metal crushed, as if someone had hammered it repeatedly against stone. The broken clasp still bore faint streaks of blood, now frozen into thin, rust-colored lines. Ephraim felt the storm inside his chest tighten. Someone had fought to get free. Someone had run. And someone had come straight through his valley. He scanned the surrounding snow but saw no body, no belongings, no sign of continued travel. Only one clue remained. Frigg, nose pressed to the wind, suddenly swung her head left toward the dark of the forest. "Got something?" Ephraim murmured. The dog moved with purpose, taut and alert. Whatever scent she'd caught, it sliced through the cold like a blade. Ephraim tightened his coat around him and followed her into the trees. The forest swallowed sound. Snow-covered branches bowed low under the storm's weight, creating tunnels of white and shadow. Ephraim moved carefully, senses sharpened from years in the field. He was no longer the soldier he once had been, but the instincts remained, quiet, steady, calculating. The trail Frigg followed was invisible to human eyes, but the dog's posture was unmistakable. Something alive had passed through here, something frightened. After nearly 30 minutes pushing through the wilderness, Ephraim saw it. Fabric caught on a branch, a dark blue fiber torn and stiff with ice. He plucked it free, rubbing it between his calloused fingers. Tactical material, government issue. Frigg growled softly, her eyes fixed on a narrow clearing ahead. Ephraim stepped into it and felt the wind change. A faint indentation lay beneath a large pine tree, its branches heavy with snow. He knelt, brushing the powder aside, revealing a shallow depression in the earth, as if someone had collapsed there, fought to rise, and stumbled away. Beside it lay a glove, black, insulated, worn at the fingertips. He lifted it. Inside, faint initials were stamped on the lining, MK. The letters sent a jolt through him. Someone trained, someone prepared, someone who should not have ended up alone in a place like this. Then Frigg barked sharply, spinning toward the western ridge. Her tail stiffened, her stance widened. Ephraim followed her gaze. Far up the slope, hardly visible through the snow, was a figure, brief, flickering, then gone. He didn't know whether it was real or a trick of the storm, but Frigg had seen it too. The sun was slipping behind the mountains by the time Ephraim and Frigg returned to the cabin. Snow thickened to a near-blind curtain, turning the valley into a white labyrinth. Inside, he lit the iron stove, warmth slowly chasing the cold from the room, but his mind remained elsewhere. A one-way trail, a shattered cuff, blood, government fabric, initials. A fleeting figure in the storm. His training told him someone was in trouble. His instincts told him trouble was coming for him. He sat heavily on the wooden stool, rubbing his hands together as the fire crackled. Frigg lay near the door, muscles still tight, eyes fixed on the window. She sensed the shift as clearly as he did. Greywind Valley was no longer the silent refuge they had built together. Something had entered it, something desperate, something dangerous. Ephraim thought of Maeve and Kalia, not with the drowning grief that usually consumed him, but with a sharp clarity he hadn't felt in years. His wife had always told him he couldn't resist helping people. "It's who you are," she'd laugh, brushing hair from her face. "Even when it makes everything harder." He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that truth now. He had chosen this valley to escape the world, yet the world had a way of finding him. And tonight, as wind clawed at the walls and Frigg growled low in her throat, Ephraim realized something. Someone out there needed help. Someone out there might already be dying, and he might be the only soul within 20 miles capable of saving them. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, Ephraim reached for his coat. The storm hit Greywind Valley with a force Ephraim Calder had not felt in years. Howling wind that clawed at the cabin walls and snow so dense it looked as if the world were dissolving into white nothingness. Night had fallen early, smothered beneath the blizzard's weight. Inside the cabin, Ephraim tightened the latch on the window, the edges of his coat still dusted with frost from his earlier search. Frigg lay near the door, but not resting. Her muscles were rigid, her breathing fast. The dog's amber eyes, usually calm and steady, darted toward the window as if she sensed something pulsing in the storm. Then she bolted upright. In the next heartbeat, she lunged at the door, claws scraping the wood. A low, desperate howl tore from her throat, a sound Ephraim had never heard from her, raw, urgent, the unmistakable cry of a creature sensing dying life. Ephraim snatched his gloves and coat, his military instincts igniting faster than thought. He flung the door open, wind slamming against him so hard, the cold felt like knives slicing across his skin. The storm swallowed sound, but Frigg's howl continued, threaded with frantic urgency. "Lead me!" Ephraim shouted through the wind. Frigg leapt forward, her silhouette vanishing and reappearing through sheets of snow as Ephraim followed, boots crunching through drifts that rose nearly to his knees. His breaths came ragged, but he pushed onward, guided by the dog's determination. She was not reacting to fear, she was reacting to a life slipping away. And she was right. The beam of Ephraim's flashlight cut through the blizzard, just long enough to catch a shape hanging from a low, splintered tree limb, a human body suspended by twisted rope, swaying like a broken pendulum in the storm. The sight hit him with physical force. He surged forward. The body was a woman, small-framed but strong, dressed in a dark tactical jacket now torn open, revealing bruises blackening across her ribs. Her hair, chestnut brown and matted with snow, hung over her face. Her skin, pale beneath the frostbite, still held the faint warmth of life. She was breathing, but shallowly. Ephraim grabbed her waist, cutting the rope with his knife until her weight fell into his arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he brushed her hair aside, revealing a face marked by grit and resolve, even in unconsciousness. Her cheekbones were sharp, her jaw defined, the remnants of freckles scattered across skin that had once carried more color. She looked to be in her early 30s. Pinned to her jacket, barely hanging on, was a battered badge. Lieutenant Mara Kesley. He had heard the name before, a local officer known for stubbornness and integrity, someone who took rural cases personally. She was the kind of law enforcer who remembered people's dogs' names and who brought food to widowers after storms. Her colleagues said she worked too hard, cared too much, and trusted too easily. Now someone had tried to kill her. A sound at his feet snapped Ephraim from the thought. Half whine, half gasp. He aimed his flashlight downward. A German shepherd lay partially buried in the snow, curled around Mara's legs, as if trying to shield her. The dog was older than Frigg, maybe 6 years, with a thick black saddle coat and gray dusting around the muzzle. His chest rose in faint, trembling breaths. Blood darkened his fur near the shoulder. Despite the pain, he lifted his head weakly when Ephraim knelt. Eyes dark, determined, loyal beyond reason. The dog's tag read, "Bramble." "You fought for her, didn't you?" Ephraim murmured. The dog blinked once, as if acknowledging the truth. Working quickly, Ephraim lifted Mara over his shoulder and scooped Bramble into his other arm. The added weight nearly threw him off balance, but adrenaline surged through him, sharpening every reflex. Frigg circled protectively, barking into the storm as Ephraim trudged back toward the cabin with both lives hanging by a thread. The cabin door slammed shut behind them as the wind roared like a living creature outside. Ephraim laid Mara gently on his cot, then set Bramble beside the stove. Frigg sniffed the injured dog cautiously before settling close enough to share warmth without crowding him. Ephraim worked with swift precision, cutting rope burns from Mara's wrists, wrapping her injuries with the few medical supplies he kept, and warming her with blankets. Her body was bruised across the ribs, a laceration on her scalp still bleeding sluggishly. Someone had beaten her deliberately, methodically. Her breathing fluctuated, sharp, shallow, then steadier. Ephraim held her wrist for a pulse. Weak but present, he whispered, "Stay with me, Lieutenant." Bramble whined, struggling to rise despite his injuries. Ephraim gently pushed him back down. "You did enough. Rest." The dog's eyes, full of pain but fierce with devotion, closed slowly. Minutes stretched into an hour. The storm pounded the cabin walls like fists. Ephraim watched Mara closely, ready for any change. Finally, her eyelids fluttered. Her cracked lips parted. Cold? Her voice was broken, rasping. Ephraim leaned closer. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You're in my cabin. I found you hanging in the storm." Her eyes opened a sliver, pale green, dulled by shock, but still sharp enough to assess him. She took in his rugged face, the dark stubble, the weather-beaten skin, the deep-set eyes that held a mixture of grief and discipline. Something in her expression softened, as if she saw a man who had once run toward danger, not away from it. "Calder," she whispered. "You know me? People talk. Ex-Navy. Living alone. Quiet." Her breath hitched, and she tensed suddenly, pain shooting through her side. Ephraim steadied her. "What happened to you?" Mara swallowed, forcing words out piece by piece. "Tracking, smugglers, weapons, off record, someone inside." She winced, eyes shutting tightly. Ephraim waited until she continued. "They knew, followed me, captured me." Her fingers twitched against the blanket. "I escaped, barely. Bramble saved me, but—" Her breath faded into a whisper, so fragile he had to lean close to hear it. "They're coming." Ephraim felt a chill, colder than the storm, slide through him. "Who's coming?" Her lips trembled. "Not just smugglers. Someone high up. Doesn't want this found." She forced her eyes open, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "I found something. In Ravenfall Canyon. Something nobody should have seen." Her body shook with the effort, her voice dissolving into ragged breaths. Ephraim eased her back down. "Rest," he said. "You're safe here." But he knew that wasn't entirely true. Outside, the storm raged, covering tracks, hiding sounds, masking movement. The perfect time for someone to erase unfinished business. He looked at Mara, battered but alive. He looked at Bramble, wounded yet loyal. He looked at Frigg, standing guard at the door, her body coiled like a spring, and he knew that Greywind Valley was no longer just his refuge. It had become a battlefield. The storm had weakened by midnight, but Greywind Valley still groaned under the weight of wind that dragged along the mountain walls like a restless spirit. Inside the cabin, the fire had died down to embers, casting long shadows over the wooden floor. Ephraim Calder had barely slept, not because exhaustion didn't bite at his bones, but because danger breathed too closely against the cabin walls. Lieutenant Mara Kesley lay wrapped beneath 2 wool blankets, her bruised ribs rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. In the firelight, her pale green eyes flickered open now and then, their usual strength dulled but not extinguished. Her face still bore streaks of dried blood along her cheekbone, her chestnut hair tangled and matted after hours in the blizzard. Even broken, she carried the stubborn resolve of someone who refused to let the world swallow her. Bramble, her canine partner, rested nearby. The older German shepherd's coat, black with a dusting of gray along the muzzle, was still sticky with dried blood. But after water, blankets, and careful bandaging, his breaths came steadier. His dark eyes followed every movement Ephraim made, as though silently judging whether the man was trustworthy enough to guard the woman he protected with his life. Frigg, Ephraim's 4-year-old sable German shepherd, lay poised by the door. Unlike Bramble, she was uninjured, alert, ears turning toward the distant wind as if listening for footsteps that had not yet reached them. She had never once looked away from the cabin's entrance since Ephraim returned with the wounded officer. The storm outside may have slowed, but something else, something human, was approaching. Mara stirred with a sharp inhale, gripping the blanket as a tremor of pain shot through her ribs. Ephraim moved to her side immediately, supporting her shoulder as she struggled to sit up. "You shouldn't move," he said quietly. "We don't have the luxury of shouldn't," she rasped. Her voice was hoarse, but the look she gave him was clear. She remembered everything. Ephraim gave her water, watching as her trembling fingers wrapped around the cup. She drank slowly, then leaned back, eyes fixed on the flames as though they steadied her. "I didn't finish telling you," she murmured. "You told me enough," Ephraim replied, but she shook her head. "No, you need the rest if we want to survive the next 24 hours. The words settled heavily in the room. Ephraim waited as she gathered strength to continue. "I'd been tracking a group for months," Mara said. "Gun runners operating out of abandoned mines and decommissioned ranger stations. The kind of men who don't belong to any group officially, just mercenaries with a taste for chaos." She winced as the memory tightened her injuries. Ephraim steadied her again, his rough, calloused hands gentle despite their size. "In Ravenfall Canyon," she whispered, "I found something I wasn't supposed to, something they were guarding." "What did you see?" Ephraim asked. Mara's eyes darkened. "A bunker, reinforced, newly built, not old. And the weapons inside weren't ordinary contraband. We're talking military-grade crates packed in silence. No serials, no paperwork, no origin. The kind of weapons that start wars if placed in the wrong hands." Ephraim felt the old weight return to his chest, the burden of someone who knew too much about conflict, someone who had once contributed to the machinery of war. "Someone in authority covered it up," Mara said. "Someone with resources." Her fingers dug into the blanket. "When I realized what I'd stumbled into, it was already too late. They were waiting for me. They took my radio, my dog, my sidearm. They dragged me into the forest, beat me until I couldn't stand. Bramble saved me, twice. Bit one of them so badly he nearly lost his hand." The older German shepherd lifted his head weakly, tail thumping against the floor once in stubborn pride. "They tied me to that tree," Mara whispered. "Said if anyone found me, they'd understand the message. And if they didn't, the storm would do the job for them." Ephraim clenched his jaw. "But you escaped." Mara shook her head faintly. "Not escaped." Bramble chewed through the rope. "I just didn't get far. The storm took me before the cold did." Silence filled the room for a long moment, thick and suffocating. Ephraim felt the familiar ache rise inside him. Memory, grief, the ghost of his wife's voice begging him not to walk past people who needed him. "We have to leave before sunrise," Mara said quietly. "If they know I'm alive, they'll come." "They already do," Ephraim said. "They tracked you once. They can track you again." Through the window, the wind shifted, just enough for Frigg to lift her head sharply. A low growl vibrated through her chest. Bramble lifted his head too, despite his injuries. Ephraim's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're out there." Mara struggled upright, teeth clenched as pain rippled through her. She wasn't helpless. Her spirit refused to allow it, but her body lagged behind her will. She reached for her side where a holster would normally be. Ephraim noticed the instinct immediately. He opened a drawer and handed her a small hunting knife. "It's not much." Her fingers closed around it with grim familiarity. "It's enough." Ephraim gathered his gear, heavy coat, gloves, a compact rifle he rarely used but maintained in perfect condition. He strapped a small pack onto Frigg, containing emergency supplies, then gently secured a lighter, padded harness around Bramble so the injured dog wouldn't strain himself. "We're moving now?" Mara asked, her voice a whisper of disbelief. "You said sunrise is too late," Ephraim replied. "So we go in the dark. Storm's dying, but the snow will cover our tracks for a while." She stared at him, eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to understand the man who stood before her, rugged, silent, grief-worn, but already preparing to risk his life for her. "Why help me?" she asked softly. "You could have walked away." Ephraim met her gaze. For a moment the fire cast shadows across the hard lines of his face, the stubble along his jaw, the deep-set pain in his eyes that he never spoke of. "Because someone walked away from the people I loved," he said. "I'm not making that mistake again." Mara didn't reply, but something in her expression softened. Not pity, but recognition. They were both survivors of battles they never asked for. Ephraim guided her to her feet, steadying her as she struggled to balance. Bramble pressed against her side, offering strength. Frigg circled close, ready to lead or attack depending on what the night required. Outside the door, the storm rumbled like distant thunder. Ephraim took one long breath, then opened the cabin door into the black, snow-laden night. Snowflakes spiraled around them like ash. The mountain ridge groaned with the shifting wind, and far off, so faint someone without a soldier's ear wouldn't notice, the crunch of footsteps moved through the dark. They were no longer alone. "Stay close," Ephraim whispered. "We head toward the canyon." And together, man, wounded officer, two loyal dogs, they stepped into the freezing darkness, leaving behind the fragile safety of the cabin and moving toward Ravenfall Canyon, where the truth waited. The night had settled into a bruised darkness by the time Ephraim Calder, Lieutenant Mara Kesley, and the two German shepherds reached the outskirts of Ravenfall Canyon. The storm had eased, leaving behind an uneasy stillness that clung to the mountains like held breath. In the dim moonlight, the canyon opened before them, a jagged wound carved into the earth, its walls coated in layers of white frost. The snow drifted in thin veils, swirling between the narrow cliffs, catching the pale glow of the moon as if suspended in time. Ephraim paused at the canyon rim, his breath rising in foggy plumes. His rugged face, broad jaw shadowed with stubble, deep-set eyes hardened by years of grief, reflected calm calculation even as cold gnawed at his skin. Mara stood beside him, her chestnut hair disheveled, her pale green eyes dulled by exhaustion but burning with determination. Her face was still marred with bruises, dark streaks along her cheekbone, a cut above her eyebrow. Yet she held herself upright with a stubborn pride that refused to let pain slow her. Bramble, her older black and gray K9, stayed close at her leg. His breathing was heavier than before, each inhale hitching slightly beneath his bandages, but the dog's resolve remained iron. Frigg, Ephraim's sable German shepherd, stood at the canyon's edge, body low, ears perked forward, ready. The air tasted wrong, too sharp, too metallic. The canyon hid something alive and something hunting. They descended along the narrow path, snow crunching underfoot. Ephraim's flashlight remained off. Light would only give away their position, but the thin wash of moonlight guided them between boulders and brittle shrubs. Mara leaned on Ephraim when pain shot through her ribs, but she never complained. She had the steely resilience of someone who had learned to survive without expecting rescue. Halfway down the canyon, Frigg halted suddenly, her body stiffening as a low, rolling growl rumbled from her chest. Bramble's ears twitched, his lips curled despite his weakened state. Ephraim motioned for Mara to kneel behind a fallen trunk. She obeyed, wincing as she crouched. Ephraim moved just ahead of her, rifle raised, scanning the ridgeline. Footsteps crunched on the snow above them, slow, careful, more than one set. Then a voice, deep, grainy, echoed faintly down the slope. "She's alive," tracks lead straight into the canyon. A second voice, younger and edged with impatience, replied, "Then finish it. You heard the boss. No survivors." Mara's fingers tightened around the knife Ephraim had given her. Her breath trembled, not with fear, but with fury. Ephraim glanced back at her. He saw the spark of a fighter who refused to die dangling in a tree. He nodded once. She understood. The men descended. 3 shapes emerged through the curtain of snow, armed, heavily dressed in dark tactical coats, faces shadowed beneath thick beards and hard eyes. All carried rifles. One of them, the leader, was unmistakable, tall, broad-shouldered, with cruel eyes, and a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. His beard was thick and unkempt, streaked with gray. He looked like a man forged in violence, with a face that had never known remorse. His name was Garin Leach, a mercenary known in certain circles for cleaning up the mistakes of powerful men. Garin halted, scanning the canyon. His voice rumbled with quiet confidence. "She's here. Spread out." Frigg didn't wait. The German shepherd lunged forward with a burst of speed, launching herself at the nearest gunman. The man barely registered motion before she hit him square in the chest, knocking him backward, his rifle clattering against the rocks. Snow exploded around them as Frigg snapped at his wrist, forcing him to scream. The second gunman swung his weapon toward her, but Bramble, despite his injuries, surged forward with a hoarse growl. He rammed into the shooter's leg, knocking the gun sideways. The weapon fired into the canyon wall, sending ice shards scattering. "Bramble, no!" Mara cried, reaching for him, but Ephraim grabbed her arm, pulling her back behind cover. Bullets whistled past, burying into the snow. Garen Leach barked an order, "Take them out!" Ephraim rose from behind the fallen trunk and fired a single precise shot. The second gunman dropped, clutching his shoulder as his weapon spiraled away. Ephraim moved with the reflex of a trained operator, silent, efficient, focused. The old instincts he tried to bury surged to the surface. He motioned for Mara to stay down, then sprinted between boulders with fluid precision. Frigg had forced the first man onto his back, snarling inches from his throat. Ephraim signaled her off and caught the dropped rifle, kicking it far into the snow. The gunman crawled backward, terror overtaking his bravado. "Who sent you?" Ephraim demanded, but the man only spat blood, eyes filled with a fanatic certainty that chilled the air. "You won't survive this canyon." A gun cocked. Ephraim spun, raising his rifle. Garen Leach aimed from 20 feet away, his expression calm, almost amused. "You're a hard man to track, Calder," Garen said. "Didn't expect to find the Navy's ghost living in a shack." Ephraim's jaw tightened. Mara struggled to rise behind him, leaning on the rock face. Bramble stood in front of her, shaking but protective. "What's in the bunker?" Ephraim demanded. Garen smirked. "Things far above your pay grade, soldier." His finger tightened on the trigger. "Step aside." "Not happening." The canyon descended into chaos. Garen fired. Ephraim dove sideways, snow erupting where he had stood. Frigg lunged at Garen from behind, slamming into his back. He staggered, cursing, twisting to strike her with the butt of his rifle. She yelped but stayed on him, teeth sinking into his sleeve. Mara, despite her injuries, pushed away from the rock, grabbed the fallen gunman's sidearm, and fired a shaky but accurate shot. The bullet grazed Garen's leg, making him stumble. Ephraim seized the opening. He tackled Garen full force, the impact sending both men crashing into the snow. Garen swung wildly, his fist catching Ephraim's jaw. Ephraim countered with an elbow drive to the ribs, then pinned the larger man with his weight. "You should have stayed gone," Garen snarled. "Maybe," Ephraim growled, "but she didn't." He struck Garen once, hard. The man went limp. Silence fell. Only the sound of the wind, the panting of dogs, and the slow collapse of tension filled the canyon. Then, faint at first, a distant thumping echoed overhead. A helicopter, search and rescue, or police backup. Snow whipped around them as the chopper descended, its spotlight cutting a golden beam across the canyon. Mara shielded her eyes as she stood, unsteady but alive. Bramble pressed against her leg. She rested a trembling hand on his head. Ephraim stepped beside her, bruised, bleeding from a cut along his cheek, but standing tall. Mara grabbed his hand, firm, grateful, warm despite the cold. "You saved me," she whispered to Watt, "and in doing it, you saved yourself." Ephraim looked toward Frigg, who was joyfully burying her face in the snow, tail wagging with unrestrained pride. Bramble lay beside Mara, exhausted but safe. For the first time in years, Ephraim felt the valley breathe differently, softer, warmer, as if the wind itself recognized change, as if Grey Wind Valley was offering him a beginning, not a place to hide. In the end, when the storm finally broke and the first light of dawn touched the snow, it wasn't the victory in Ravenfall Canyon that mattered most. It was the reminder that even in our darkest winters, God never leaves us wandering alone. Sometimes he sends help not as thunder from the heavens, but as quiet courage in the hearts of ordinary people. A man who thought he no longer had a purpose, a wounded officer who refused to give up, two loyal German shepherds who stood guard when hope seemed lost. And maybe, just maybe, the moment Ephraim reached out his hand to save Mara was the very moment God reached out to save him too, because miracles don't always arrive wrapped in light. Sometimes they come as second chances, hidden in snowstorms, carried on the backs of loyal dogs, or whispered through the winds of a lonely valley. And in our everyday lives, we face our own storms. Days when grief feels too heavy, when loneliness sits beside us like an old shadow, when we believe no one sees our struggle. But this story reminds us God sees, God listens, and God sends help, even when we think we're beyond saving. Sometimes the miracle is simply the strength to take one more step, or the courage to protect someone else, or the faith to believe that tomorrow's sunrise will be gentler than today's storm. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share your thoughts below. Comment your favorite moment. Share this video with someone who needs a little hope today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, miracles, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. May the Lord bless you, watch over your family, and guide your steps through every valley in your life. May God protect you today and always. Amen.